has long had a high influence. From the point of view of most American Jews, I can tell you from my own experience, and I think it's pretty standard, support for Israel was deeply enculturated, for American Jewry, period. And again, it was not seen or foreseen that this was a genocidal impulse, and it was on overwhelmingly secular grounds. So there's very little religious orthodoxy in the Israel lobby at all. You don't even hear about it. My own guess is the following, therefore it's, again, not an insider's view. First, I don't think most wealthy American political figures or leaders of the Israel lobby, and that's a lot of people on Wall Street, for example, a lot of very big money, I don't think they really understand much at all about this biblical or philosophical or religious nationalist or ideological view. It's more a knee-jerk, support Israel, period. Israel's under threat, support it, period. So I think that there's very little understanding. And again, I'm being a little bit introspective because my own understanding needed a massive scaling up just to understand what was going on and who are these figures, many of whom I had never heard of before, until they became agents of genocide. So this is one part. Second, a politician like Biden, who's nothing but an old school politician. We have no idea what his real state of mind is, capacity to think, or anything else right now, frankly. But his instinct completely is don't show a shade of gap with Israel. Now, by the way, even saying that, it's amazing how even Biden has been out there saying this is terrible what's happening, and have some more bombs, by the way. So I don't think it's cynical, actually, although, of course, in outcome, it's profoundly cynical. It's pathetic is what it is. It's pathetic in that Biden, as a person, clearly sees this is horrendous. It's not a fake. It's not a disguise. But what's pathetic is how weak it is, because the guy, for God's sake, is president of the United States, and he should pick up the phone and say to Netanyahu, you're not getting any more weapons, period. Not with this mass killing. And the United States could shut this down in a day if it chose to. But it doesn't choose to, not because it supports genocide or ethnic cleansing, but because it's so deeply ingrained. Don't get ahead of the Israeli lobby bulldozer. It's a bad thing to do. Now, even with all of that, the American Jewish community is, at this point, pretty much in angst and deeply divided. It's in this way a little bit impressive, I would say, although you wouldn't think it's too impressive. But, support for Israel is collapsing among the Jews in America, not just among American society more generally. What's happening is disgraceful, disgusting, illegal, murderous. There's no other word for it, or words for it. And so this is actually permeating a lot of American society. But the political class doesn't live on public opinion. It lives on campaign contributions. And so one big billionaire campaign contributor outweighs a hell of a lot of percentage points of American public opinion till now. I'm not giving up. I'm speaking out because I want the United States to stop arming Israel, period. And not in weeks or months, today, this hour, this moment. And I'm making the point every day because I live in the UN context. We're the last bulwark for a genocide right now. No one else supports this in the whole world. By the way, no one else practically could support it. Some European countries, like Germany, are afraid to speak out for their own historical and political reasons. But it's only the United States practically that enables this to go on hour by hour. And so I'm trying to make the case in the US, we're completely isolated. It's completely horrible. It is not complicated. It is not complicated. It's not, oh my God, what are we going to do about Hamas and so forth? There are other ways to security than killing tens of thousands of people and starving hundreds of thousands of people. There is such a thing called diplomacy. And this is conveniently or inconveniently or obnoxiously forgotten by the United States because they're not trying diplomacy. But this is the real answer.
No, I agree with you, and I think what you're saying is really very profound. I think for the vast majority of Americans, and I've lived in America, and the idea of Israel is just this romantic thing from Hollywood. I call it Harvey Weinstein Zionism, essentially, where you just get your ideas from all of these amazing Hollywood films, where Israel is the underdog that's out there making the deserts bloom and being fought by all these irrational, crazy people who just hate them for the sake of hating them.
It's a good point, by the way. The bestseller movie was Exodus, not Nakba. So,
exactly.
If there was Nakba, there would also be understanding of what this is all about. Yeah. So you could really have a human solution. But it is a set of images and not a deep understanding, which is a big problem.
And it continues to become more and more separated from the reality on the ground because, as you said, today's Israel is being controlled. I mean, the most important influential ministers are the two you mentioned, Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And I think, you don't have anybody that can be in any way comparable within American politics. It's completely unimaginable for anyone to come up in the U.S. and say, we should do to blacks in the U.S. what? Imagine if just someone said exactly the same thing that Smotrich says. I mean, Ben Gvir said the need for my family to be able to drive around the streets of the West Bank is more important than anything for the Palestinians. Smotrich said Palestinians have three options. They can leave, they can die, or they can live subjugated to Israelis. I mean, just imagine somebody.
And by the way, he put out a plan. It's not just a slogan. Yeah. He actually put out a plan. So you have a major Israeli minister with an elaborate plan of ethnic cleansing or murder or departure. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
But of course, people need to read that. They don't read that. They don't know. Again, even these. The Israel lobby isn't exactly going out of its way to give us a reading list. And so you have to search this stuff out.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more time goes on, I think what's happening is just this cognitive dissonance that 6 months of just mass slaughter. I mean, conditioning and propaganda is very difficult to break, but I think a lot of people are beginning to just ask questions now because this doesn't sound like they're just out there to fight terrorism and get the hostages. I mean, there are certainly easier ways. It seems very clear, as many of the hostages' families are saying, it's very clear that the last thing Netanyahu wants at this point is a deal that frees the hostages. Because the real goal for him and for his coalition, it's a golden opportunity to use the hostages as an excuse to destroy all of Gaza, to use Hamas's intransigence and Hamas's fanaticism as an excuse to just destroy all Gaza, make it uninhabitable, and get hopefully a couple of million people to leave. That's what Smotrich said.
I think that's right. And if it isn't right, it would take 5 minutes for Netanyahu to make clear that it isn't right. Because all Netanyahu would have to say is, and you may then agree or not agree or whatever, but he would have to say, our enemy is Hamas, but we agree that there will be a Palestinian state, have no doubt about that. Of course, he's never going to say that. This is antithetical. But if he did mean that this is about Hamas, then there's a way to say that and not lose the other 191 UN member states, putting the United States in this limbo position as the 192nd. because there are 193 UN member states in all, and none support Israel to be the greater Israel, which is what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir certainly want, and what certainly what Netanyahu wants as well. So if it were really about security, Israel could say so in a way that is, at least from that point of view, clear. But the fact that Netanyahu, at a minimum, prevaricates about the post-war situation in Gaza really means, of course, that the goal is not defeat Hamas. The goal is greater Israel. And there's not the slightest attempt to dissuade anybody from that supposition, which he could easily do.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to also ask you, you're in touch with RFK Jr. and you're working as an economic advisor, I believe, to his campaign, or?
Well, I'm a friend. We're classmates. I like him, but he does not have an acceptable position on this issue, and I'm not endorsing him under these circumstances, because this is, to my mind, both in and of itself extremely important. And as I've said to him, it's also a test. If you don't recognize this as a genocide, what do you do? And so I'm trying my best to explain my point of view to him. Let me just say, almost all the time. So, and so far, not clearly to any success.
Yeah, I think it's massively disappointing, because I mean he was one of the first candidates in a very long time in the U.S. that seems to be offering something different when he talks about foreign policy, when he talks about all kinds of issues. He's even in monetary policy, he's open to Bitcoin and so on. And then
I like Bobby a lot, and we've been friends we were in school together more than 50 years ago, to show my age, but also to just point out we've known each other for a very long time. I like him enormously, but I cannot support a candidate that cannot get this right. I can't.
Yeah. And of course, your hero is his uncle, JFK, and you've written a book about his uncle and his quest. And what are your thoughts on the difference between the two of them, and how do you think JFK would have handled this?
Well, I tell Bobby all the time, be like your dad and your uncle, because they were both heroes for me. And I believe, actually, I'm friends with a lot of the Kennedys, and I love the Kennedy family. And I love what President John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy stood for. And Robert Kennedy was my first political love, because John F. Kennedy, I was too young. But Robert Kennedy, I was 13 when he was assassinated, and he was my candidate. And, that stays with you your whole life. So what John F. Kennedy believed in and learned, especially almost the hard way, but learned in his brief presidency, was to negotiate and to try to find peaceful solutions. And he came into the presidency in 1961, saying in his inaugural address, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He believed in talking. The next 2 years was very complicated and not very successful, because the CIA put a plan on his desk to invade Cuba, and Kennedy went along with it to his counter to his instincts, but he did go along with it, and that was the Bay of Pigs, and it was a disaster, and it led Khrushchev to put in nuclear weapons into Cuba afterwards, and that brought us to the brink of nuclear annihilation in October 1962. And Kennedy was surrounded by advisors who said, take them out, military, invade Cuba, which would have likely led to nuclear annihilation. But Kennedy had the instinct, we can find a peaceful way out of this. And in a very complicated maneuver, when there was not a Zoom, not direct communication of global leaders, back channels, teletypes, slow communication, miscommunication, misunderstanding. He worked out a peaceful settlement with Khrushchev. And in the following year, he did what I regard as one of the greatest acts of statesmanship of modern history, why I wrote a book called To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. He negotiated a peace treaty, in essence, with the Soviet Union in the form of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And what's amazing about it is, and hard for people to understand, negotiating with the Soviet Union in 1963 would be like Biden. I mean, it's possible, but Biden's never going to do it. Would be like Biden standing up and say, I want to make peace with Iran, or I want to make peace with China. Of course, he should do that. And Kennedy had the guts to do it and succeeded and made a great treaty, but it took tremendous guts. And he made a great speech on peace in June 1963 that I absolutely adore. I think it's the greatest speech by a president in modern history, one of the greatest ever. That's what I wrote my book about, this peace campaign. And many people think, and I think it's absolutely plausible, that Kennedy was killed for his peace initiative in the same way that Yitzhak Rabin was killed for calling for peace, in the same way that Martin Luther King was killed for calling for racial justice, in the same way that Robert Kennedy was killed trying to get America out of the Vietnam War. I mean, we have a very dark side, and there's not a small chance that this was a coup in 1963 with the active CIA participation at the least that took Kennedy out. But to come back to your question, these were acts of incredible human insight of John F. Kennedy to save the world and then to move the world towards peace required it required a great decency and humanity. Decency and humanity can actually get you a long way. The first thing you do is you stop dehumanizing or vilifying the other, and you start understanding that they are human beings. They have a history, they have reasons, and in the case of Palestine, plenty of excellent reasons to want something different from what there is right now. And with some basic humanity, we could sort this out peacefully, not with slaughter or ethnic cleansing or genocide, but peacefully. Of course, we have a president who is, I think, almost surely physically incapable of doing this, but also by dint of his whole political career, intellectually and emotionally incapable of doing this as well. Biden has never been a peacemaker. Biden has always been an agent of the military-industrial complex. He's always been for NATO enlargement. He's always been for dirty tricks. He played a role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in 2014. So I don't think he knows how to do this anyway, which is really terrible at this moment.
And it doesn't look like any of the three main options for the next presidential election is going to be any different. I mean, Trump seems to be similar in the sense of just being full on, give Israel everything they want. If he's critical of Biden, it's that he's not giving them enough. And JFK seems to be the same thing. I mean, it's amazing watching him just turn into evangelical Christian Zionist.
Yeah, the sad part about Bobby is that I think he'd actually win the presidency if he had the right platform, because everyone is so disgusted with Trump and Biden. I think Bobby could actually do it. And so even on purely pragmatic grounds, I wish he would do it. But of course, I want him to do it on deeper grounds, and I want him to do it on Kennedy grounds, which is make peace. It's possible. Don't dehumanize the other side. I keep telling him also, stop inflating Hamas as if it's this unbelievable monster that must be controlled and nothing can happen. without addressing that. There are nations, there are other countries, there's diplomacy, there are ways to find peace. And so I'm hoping still somehow that he'll come to that, but it better be quick.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a lost campaign anyway.
And what are your thoughts on what's happening in Ukraine? I know you've been very outspoken about this, and you have very strong opinions about U.S. policy there. What are your thoughts on how that is going and where it is going?
Well, it's basically the same thing. It's a war that absolutely, unequivocally could have been avoided at repeated periods of time, many of which I know well because I was an advisor to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin and to Kuchma, the second president of independent Ukraine. I know this region well. And basically, Ukraine should have done what it said it was going to do when it declared independence, and that's remain neutral. And that's what the people of Ukraine wanted. They know that they're a bridge between Western Europe and Russia. And as a bridge, be neutral on both sides. And they knew that, by the way, by overwhelming majorities. But the U.S. military-industrial complex could not stand that. By the way, if there's one thing that the American deep state hates, it is neutrality. It's not enemies. They love enemies. Enemies get you arms sales. They get you wars. They get you able to practice your military. But they hate neutrals. And the U.S. has a whole history of killing and overthrowing neutral leaders. By the way, it's stunning. And it's the old slogan: if you're not with us, you're against us. And they really believe that, because the statement is almost like a joke, like a caricature, that Darth Vader would say in Star Wars. But no, that's actually the American position. If you're not with us, you're against us. So they hate neutral leaders. And Ukraine the people understood this. They're so much Russian and ethnic culture and shared orthodoxy and faith and many other things. And so they wanted neutrality. They did not want NATO. And yet we had our neocons, Newland, who's about to become my colleague at Columbia. Oh my God.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be Hillary and Victoria. Yes, we said Ukraine has to become part of NATO. And that was a campaign that started in the late 1990s. Biden was absolutely on side on this. Victoria Nuland was first Cheney's advisor, then Bush's ambassador to NATO when they pushed for NATO enlargement, then Hillary's spokesperson, and then the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in 2014, when the U.S. actively participated in the overthrow of a neutral government and installed a government that said, we want NATO. So the war was provoked by NATO enlargement to this crazy degree. And by the way, completely against all the promises that had been made by George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. And James Baker III and others to Gorbachev back in 1990 that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch eastward. Anyway, it kept moving, and then it was supposed to move to Ukraine and even to the country of Georgia on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, which definitely is not a North Atlantic country, if one knows a little bit of geography. But it's this insanity of endless NATO enlargement. Well, suffice it to say, there were numerous exit ramps, and the United States refused all of them. And even after the special military operation started on February 24th, 2022, there was an immediate exit ramp, and that was the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, calling for Ukrainian neutrality and agreeing on it in talks mediated by Turkey in Ankara. And they were close to an agreement, and the United States said, no, fight on, we don't accept neutrality, fight on. And here we are till today, and Biden absolutely does not talk to Putin. All he does is insult a counterpart who happens also to have 6,000 nuclear warheads and is beating to a pulp Ukrainians, and Biden's, clever ideas to call Putin a crazy SOB. You just cannot make this up. How immature, how puerile, how ineffective, how destructive the U.S. foreign policy is. It's just unbelievable. Any chance for peace they reject because they don't believe in diplomacy.
For me, I think what is the most unconscionable thing about it is when American politicians say, look, we're fighting Putin and it's not even costing us any lives from our military. And it's just, for me, it's so callous and criminal to just, we're burning all these young Ukrainian boys and men sending them to their graves.
It's not quite Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but it's in the same ilk. They literally say it's not American lives being lost. Richard Blumenthal, senator of Connecticut, explicitly on this. Greatest bargain that money can buy. Lindsey Graham. I can't even say on public company my true view of him. Mitt Romney. They're all like this. And so it is a kind of vulgarity. Safe, we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. It's incredible to speak with you.
Likewise, we should have finished up how Bitcoin fixes this. 10 years ago, I gave a presentation at Columbia and spoke to Bitcoin. You were a bit skeptical, but a couple of years later, you emailed me saying, okay, there's something there. So I just want to get a quick reaction from you. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin? And let me just tell you why I think it fixes it. If the U.S. government can't print money, 90% of all of these problems are thrown out the door. You just can't hand over tens of billions of dollars to military contractors to keep promoting more and more wars. People are going to have to find a way to talk and reduce those conflicts. It's not going to end conflict, but I think conflict will be a lot less bloody.
Well, let's just say I agree completely that we need to find ways to talk, and we need to discuss Bitcoin because it's been an amazing ride. I'm still, I know it's completely contrary to probably almost every listener, but I'm still worried about completely unmonitored transactions, for good or for bad, because I kind of believe in the rule of law. Admittedly, my belief is predicated on the idea that governments can be made to do the right thing. So I admit our whole conversation proves me wrong on that. And so I don't want to take an overly stark view of this. I'm not by instinct a libertarian because I believe there is such thing as the common good, and I believe I'm basically an Aristotelian in my philosophy. I believe that there can be government for the good, but I know that will run against the grain, and I have to say I didn't give a single shred of evidence in favor of my views over the last hour of discussion. So I don't want to hold them too true and fast. I want to keep them open as provisional. I've been visiting Israel now for 52 years on many occasions. Israel changed. It changed a lot. There was always, of course, demands that I didn't agree with and actions that I didn't agree with. There was a movement for peace in Israel called Shalom Achav in the 1970s and 80s that I agreed with. The words in Hebrew mean peace now, not peace later, but peace now. And there were always important elements in Israel that didn't want peace now. They wanted settlements now. They wanted to delay things. But things changed in Israel. There is a difference of Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin from Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu. The leaders in the past, they wanted favorable outcomes, but they actually wanted a solution. Yitzhak Rabin died for that. He was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist, perhaps part of a broader network. We don't know all of the details of that, but there's definitely a difference, in my view, between the Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres's of Israel's past and the Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, Gallants of Israel's present. One thing that happened was the settler movement. Now, the settlement started in the occupied territories already by the late 60s and early 1970s. When I first got to Israel in 1972 as a kid, out of high school, it was explained to me that Israel was, quote, putting facts on the ground. It was going to make security arrangements by having settlements in key locations in the occupied West Bank. I thought, this doesn't sound so good. When you make facts on the ground, what you're doing is violating international law. You're creating a situation that's going to become conflictual in the years ahead. But Israel was pretty triumphant and pretty dominant in those days. But that settler movement became a religious extremist movement also. It changed culture. It brought some extremist rabbis to the forefront. It became a fervent messianic movement among hundreds of thousands of settlers and their families and friends. So suddenly, the biblical references became not just once in a while mentioned, but dominant. God gave us the whole land. Today in the United States, the police and the Congress pound on students chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. But it is the Israeli extremists who are the ones literally saying God promised us the land from the river, that is the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea. The extremism in Israel came to view not occupation, but greater Israel as a redemptive, religious, nationalist, messianic cause. I think this is a lot to do with what has happened. That, of course, some Israelis said, we have implacable foes, this is a matter of security. But a kind of messianism also became very important politically. And in Israel's fractured coalition governments, they play a disproportionate role. This is the Smotrich, who is the finance minister, Ben Gvir is the national security minister. They're absolutely extremists. And they represent a view that is extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily extreme, extraordinarily preventing any kind of peace. So in this sense, Israeli politics and Israeli culture and society changed enormously over the past 30 years. And this is a major reason why we're in this dire disaster right now, because the real leaders of this slaughter don't even hide their words. They talk openly about ethnic cleansing. They talk openly about this being all of our land. They talk openly about never a Palestinian state. And their words are so vulgar and so clear that this is how South Africa put together its application to the International Court of Justice, because it wasn't hidden, this intentionality. It was way out there in the open. I sometimes think these ministers forget that even when they speak Hebrew in their rally, someone can translate that for the rest of us who don't speak Hebrew. But the words are clear. They're extreme. They are messianic. They are biblical in reference. Netanyahu famously also talking about Amalek and destroy every man, woman, and child, as a biblical text holds from more than 2,000 years ago. Well, come on. This is not how we're going to find safety and peace, but this became a very important part of Israeli politics today.
Akali says, will the European countries start distancing themselves from Israel? lots of arm twisting, and Xi Jinping is now in Europe. Will there be more discussions?
A number of countries in Europe, in the European Union, that is, have said that they will recognize Palestine bilaterally. Spain has been actively promoting this, a number of others. I think that this is going to happen. The EU has said, don't take actions outside of us. We'll keep everything together. The US, as usual, is trying to dominate EU politics and does so to a shocking extent, again, to the EU's complete harm in the case of Ukraine. And here it tries to dictate policies to Europe that are definitely not in Europe's interest. But a number of European countries, Ireland and Spain and many others, are saying this can no longer wait. And notice very importantly, that France voted for immediate Palestinian membership in the United Nations in that vote. So this already shows that there is certainly no ability of Brussels to keep a U.S.-based party line, as it were. This is breaking because it's so outrageous.
Lim says, to what extent is this fueled by the gas and oil in the West Bank and Gaza? Without Russian gas, the U.S. and Europe have agreed and planned pipelines from Israel.
I think it is probably true that every major crisis in the region for the last 100 years has had a bit of an oil and gas subtext. I don't think it's the main driver in this, but I don't think it's completely gone either. There's lots of gas in Gaza territory, in the Mediterranean, in what would be Palestinian economic waters. There are issues that date back now 40 years to where pipelines will land coming from the Caspian Sea. There's oil in the Golan Heights where U.S. investors and Israeli investors played very dangerous games. It's amazing to me, over decades, oil and gas, generally it's like in a big orchestra. They're always playing a little bit of the tune of this. I don't think it's the major driver, however.
You have time for two more, Professor Sachs?
Sure.
From Darren Alevi, always a pleasure to hear Professor Sachs. Has he any opinions on if the UK and US have a change of administrations, the impact it will have on the Middle East or the Ukraine conflict?
Well, if there is a change of administration, there will be changes, but of a complicated sort. I support Jill Stein as candidate in the United States because she's the peace candidate. I think the most important issue in the world is peace, because we really are sliding step by step to World War III right now on multiple fronts, in Ukraine and spreading, in the Middle East and spreading, and in East Asia, over Taiwan, but now the whole South China Sea becoming increasingly militarized. Biden is an extremely weak president. Nobody's sure how much he still has it anyway. Mentally, he's too old for this, he's too infirm for this, and he's weak anyway, and his team is extremely weak. With Trump, just to say, there is a pragmatic belief that, and plausible, that Trump would basically end the Ukraine war by saying this NATO business, we don't need it. Maybe. Although Trump at the very last moment, a couple of weeks ago, kind of gave the authorization, vote for the $61 billion. As Alexander always says, who can figure out the Byzantine negotiations that underpin any of this? As an American, I can tell you, as a close watcher of this, I've worked in Congress, I've watch this. I agree with you. It's completely opaque because it's basically lobbying, money, and gamesmanship rather than principles all the way through. But when it comes to the Middle East, Trump had large financial backing by absolutely core Israel lobby leaders. The Adelsons, now Sheldon Adelson's dead, but his wife continues to be a large backer. Trump was absolutely trying this divide and conquer game. Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, talked about turning Gaza into fancy Mediterranean villas recently. God knows. And when it comes to China, Trump is absolutely beating the war drum on China. Trump is no safety in terms of global peace. No way. He will pick and choose differently, but he's not a candidate of peace. Biden is obviously not a president of peace. RFK, who I went to school with and been friendly with for 50 years. I wish that he had been the candidate of peace, but he got pulled into the rather rabid pro-Israel side, completely off base in my view. I tried to tell him many, many times, didn't succeed. So we have one peace candidate that's going to be on the ballot in the United States. That's Jill Stein. That's who I'm supporting.
Rob M. says the recent anti-Semitism law has made it illegal to say that Jesus was killed by the Jews. Do Americans realize that the Anglo-Saxon clan is no longer in charge, but a certain race with origins from the Middle East?
Well, let me just say, in general, first of all, we shouldn't be passing laws in direct violation of free speech, of thought. We have laws against that are actually, and a constitutional provision that's actually pretty good for society. We're pushing all of that to the wayside. Also, by the way, throughout Europe, it's stunning. Just the open crackdown on speech right now in general. This is not a U.S. phenomenon alone at all. This is happening throughout the so-called Western world, which had professed to have some standards about open discourse, deliberation, the public square, the importance of political rights and free political speech and so forth. So this is all going by the wayside. But you ask a different question as well, and that is, do the Anglo-Saxons know that they don't run the world anymore? A few of us know. I mean, not that I ever thought one should run the world, but no. In Washington, in the East Coast think tanks where I have, in a way, lived and worked because I've been a university professor for 44 years now at Harvard and at Columbia University. They don't know yet. They're completely fixated on maintaining U.S. hegemony. It's almost a psychological thing more than an analytical or a power thing. There is a deep, deep psychological neurotic state, I would say, in the U.S. Oh my God, are we still in charge? Are we still the lead? Britain actually thinks it still runs the world through the U.S., I have to say. So Britain had this hegemonic aspiration going back maybe to Queen Elizabeth. I don't, not the recent one. I'm talking about the the original Queen Elizabeth, but really from 1800 to at least World War I, Britain ran a lot of the world, manipulated a lot of the world, controlled a lot of the world, dominated finance, dominated the military, dominated the telegraph, dominated the rails, built a lot of the world, ran an empire that was truly global in an unprecedented way. And the U.S. picked up the baton, or thought it did, loved the expression, "This is the American century," that Henry Luce gave to the American people, the publisher of Time Life back in 1941. He told the Americans what they wanted to hear. It's your century for the world. And by the way, that was 1941, and in the Council on Foreign Relations and in Washington and the other think tanks, they're saying, hey, we still got years to go. So they really, really believe it. Definitely Biden, who lives somewhere, I would say, around the 1990s in his imagination, believes it. And this is one of the most dangerous points. This is why we have all these wars, because the United States can't stop itself from believing it can dictate everything. And this is what you guys talk about daily so correctly, so powerfully. It is this gap between this, as I say, almost neurotic belief in the United States right now, and this fear of losing power, that if you're not number one, you're somehow in dire threat, that China's about to come and invade. Of just about the most preposterous idea in our world today. But it is the view, and it continues to be the view. And deep down, they're very worried. They know we're not quite in charge. What are we going to do? But maybe we can manipulate this. Maybe we can do this. We can still defeat Putin. We can still get NATO enlargement. We can still show our way in Taiwan. This is why the world is so dangerous right now, because of this neurotic view, this gap between belief or want to believe and reality, that if we don't open our eyes and restore rationality, all of these extraordinarily dangerous events are going to become even more violent and even more inclusive of the rest of the world.
Professor Sachs, can you answer one question
I'll try.
related to the statement from Joachim Jeffries? This is from John Ski. I think this is an interesting question that I would like to hear your thoughts on. According to Jeffries, leader of the Democrats in the House, the U.S. will send troops to Ukraine if the Ukrainian front collapses. Russia has responded by beginning nuclear missile forces drills. What are your thoughts with Jeffries' recent statement?
Look, I don't think we're going to come to that, but then again, I generally underestimate irrationality, even insanity. The American people would absolutely oppose that across the board. Every political party, of course, young people, it would turn this country into turmoil. It would be the most reckless and dangerous thing. And yet, we have President Macron doing this, saying it and apparently doing it. So nothing is impossible. As stupid and dangerous and wrong-headed as it could possibly be, nothing is impossible right now. And so this is why every single day I say to as many leaders as I can, negotiate now. Don't put this off. There are so many stupid, dangerous, explosive ideas lurking that you can't just wait and hope that it comes out okay. I want Biden to pick up the phone, and I've said it every day since February. I said it actually in January 2020, December 2021 to Jake Sullivan, and I will say it every day publicly. Pick up the phone, call President Putin, and say that whole idea about NATO and Ukraine was stupid. Let's make peace, because that could bring about peace in a day.
Mr. Sachs, what happens to the euro if BRICS is able to create a currency to rival the euro or the US or the USD? Final question from Andres Bersitz.
Well, the BRICS process is happening. I support it, by the way, for a number of reasons. but it's going to take years. So this is not an imminent announcement from all I know. But the dominance of the US dollar, I believe, will decline markedly even within a decade. Most of my colleagues disagree with me because macroeconomic history says there's a long, long historical tail to the role of, in other words, a long fading out of, say, the pound sterling and so forth. I think it's going to happen faster for geopolitical and technological reasons. If uh, if the U.S. and Europe insanely confiscate Russian assets, this will accelerate all of this dramatically. It's such a mind-bogglingly stupid, illegal, harebrained idea. I can't even describe all the things wrong with it, but this would also be extremely destructive of the international financial system as we have it right now. Suffice it to say, the renminbi will play a much larger role. There could well be if not a BRICS currency, a BRICS monetary arrangement, which gives a substantially increased role to several BRICS currencies. There could be a BRICS SDR kind of arrangement, even done perhaps more ambitiously than the SDR at the IMF. But it's going to take some time to happen.
Well, it is true. I think it's right that as far back as we can look in history to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to the Hebrew conquests of Canaan, and so on, every group believed that their success was that God was on their side. When Britain became the dominant power in the 19th century, it didn't say, well, we were lucky we had the steam engine. Now we can kick the shit out of everyone else. They said, well, we are the great civilization. And the fact that we have the steam engine means either A, B, C, or D. We are superior genetically, we are superior culturally, we are God's choice, we are the new Israel, whatever you want, and that's the multiple choice question. But it's always some confirmation of superiority. So this is, again, I think, pretty deep-seated culturally. It manifests itself in different ways, but why doesn't it self-correct? Well, I think one thing, and it's, for me, I believe my lucky life experience and professional experience is that early on I decided I wanted to work on the issues of economic development because I thought, why do we have poverty still? This is a wealthy world. And so I spent most of my time looking at the United States from the outside in. Most of my students have been foreign born, I would guess, if I added them up over the years. I have students in senior positions in governments all over the world. So for me, it would be pretty weird to be seeing things from a U.S. perspective. I know that when a senator or a congressman, and they really do prove your point about how hard it is to know whether they're idiots or whether because they're dumb on top of everything else in general. They're poorly educated, but they don't even know what they're talking about. They've never been to the places they're talking about. They haven't. It's just unbelievable to listen to them. But I don't think that it's just conniving. I think it's deeply rooted in this self-superiority and in the channels of information. And my main recommendation in life, period, is talk to someone else. Go abroad, go listen, make connections. And my main advice on geopolitics is talk to the other side. The biggest stupidity of our age is there's no one to talk to. Well, this is partly a lie, but it's partly a misunderstanding. I get a lot of hate mail, I would say, from Israel right now, because I'm speaking out that what Israel is doing is completely ruthless and genocidal. And how can you say that, Mr. Sachs? Don't you know they're all out to kill us? And I say, well, I was just in Egypt, and I was just in the Emirates, and I was recently in Saudi Arabia, and I was and so forth. And they're not all out to kill you. Have you been to any of these places? No, I don't have to be in these places because I know they're all out to kill us. So there's no human contact, and it seems that this is a pretty vital part of the story, actually. It's an old theory, Gordon Allport in U.S. Race psychology, the contact theory. I think it's, he stated it seems a little simple in the first statement of it, but I think there's truth to it, which is if you don't know, if you don't have the personal experience, you don't know that you don't know.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. So that brings me to a related question that I have.
We're gonna have to stop shortly because I have another call actually that started a few minutes ago.
So I'll make this the final question. So it was noted that in the previous discussion, also during that Athens Democracy Forum, you were interrupted when you started saying these things about Western society, which actually may reflect our society's reluctance to openly address these issues of race and white supremacy. So my question is, finally, why do you think that there is now a significant generational shift with younger, more diverse groups engaging more critically with these issues, particularly in the context of, for example, the protests for Gaza?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Clearly, many things are at work. One of them is intellectual discourse has been opened up in the last 50 years because really the discourse and the history was written almost entirely by the victors, and that is by white Anglo-Saxon professors and so forth. And that stopped being true, thank goodness. There's a lot of history that is coming from people who have been victimized or enslaved or genocided. And this is, students read these things, so the students are well aware of things. The fact that students read these things is now being attacked by the Congress in the United States wholeheartedly. How dare you we have our idiotic columnists in the New York Times telling us what students should read and so forth. And so there's a backlash against this. How dare you teach these things? How dare you teach white hate, they call it. It's not white hate, it's trying to explain the history of all of this. But students are much, much more aware of these issues because there's now been, it actually is almost a century of history being written by those who experienced it the hard way. In the United States, the greatest breakthrough in history writing, unbelievable, was W.E.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, because one African-American genius took on the entire academic establishment to rewrite American history, and he did it successfully because he was such a genius, and the history that was being told was such a lie. But we now have this with respect to Israel, for example. The story about Israel, has been rewritten by Israel's own historians. Many of them chased out of the country afterwards, who are now, quote, in exile in a way, because they received such hate for exposing true history within the country. Second, obviously, is the student body itself is much more diverse. We have international student bodies, so this is invaluable. Invaluable for us, the faculty, and invaluable for the other students. And the third is the social media, which is you see things in front of your eyes, not screened by one national station or one broadcasting unit, or we used to have three in the United States. And this also shows, what idiots these people in Congress are in the United States. They decided, well, now we have to shut down TikTok. And it has nothing to do with China. They say it because they're also idiots that sometimes they even tell the truth. That students are seeing terrible things on TikTok in Gaza, so we have to close this down. So this is also part of what's happening. We have a much more open discourse, but the truth of the matter is it's not open enough, and we're edging towards World War III, and I don't know whether we're going to keep this under control, because in Europe and the United States, which are supposedly open societies, we have a not completely, but almost completely closed mainstream media. It's absolutely alarming. And we have incredibly reckless politicians talking about nuclear war. Well, that's going to be a great way to put an end to our discussions, isn't it? This is really the biggest danger right now, which is that as this kind of white-dominated world comes to an end, this Western European, U.S.-dominated world comes to an end in the right way, which is through the rise to power and dignity and sovereignty of all parts of the world. How desperate will the U.S. be, or NATO, to hold its supposed illusory, delusional advantage? This is what we're in the midst of right now, this question.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll see a political version of the Planck principle, where science advances one funeral at a time. Maybe politics will do this.
Well, let's not do it one war at a time. We can't afford that. So we really need to make some breakthroughs, and I'm very proud of our students in helping that this year.
Well, it's a genocide, and I think the International Court of Justice will most likely reach that definitive conclusion when it makes its final decision. It made an interim decision saying that there were plausible grounds that Israel is committing a genocide. More recently, the special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council has also said that Israel is making genocidal actions according to the standards of the 1948 Genocide Convention. So genocide is, of course, is a horrific crime, but it's also a legal standard. It's based on a global convention that was promulgated and adopted in 1948 after the Holocaust, and it puts forward rigorous conditions, and it seems to me that Israel is violating those conditions. Ultimately, while there's the very practical issue of the war and the deaths, and that is a practical issue for politics, diplomats, statesmen, and the like, there's also a legal standard which will be adjudicated, and which, to my mind, points to this completely shocking and awful fact that we are most likely seeing a genocide before our eyes, and it's been going on for months, and the world, not the world, the big powers, and especially the United States, are unwilling, unable to take basic actions to stop it. So the difference of this and the Holocaust or other earlier genocides is that they weren't recorded day by day on video. And now we see live coverage, we see journalistic reports, albeit Israel is almost surely targeting and killing journalists in large numbers. This is another basic fact in an attempt to hide what's going on. But Israeli soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces themselves post their own videos celebrating the destruction of Gaza. So we see day to day, and yet the world doesn't stop it.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating to be watching this. The toll that it has taken on people for 6 months is just insane. I think I agree with you, obviously, and I think one thing that is perhaps unique about this genocide, as far as I can tell, I don't think there are many genocides where the leaders of the perpetrating army were quite so vocal and so clear about the fact that they are out there to destroy an entire population. I mean, it's just, it's if Palestinians had tried to fabricate um, fake quotes made by Israeli leaders, I don't think they could have come up with something as damning as what the Israeli leaders themselves have said. I mean, you have the president of Israel who said there is no such thing as an innocent civilian in Gaza. We're talking about a population of 2.3 million people, half of which is under the age of 18, roughly, and so a very large number of children. And he's just out there saying, for us, there are no innocent civilians. The prime minister of Israel is also going on about invoking verses from the Bible, which specifically instruct to spare no child, no woman, not even spare their cattle. And this is what the soldiers are singing about and posting on YouTube. We've never had anything like this. I don't. I mean, I think perhaps in the Rwandan genocide there was some kind of public, but the world wasn't paying attention. So it wasn't as if the Rwandan leadership was getting on CNN and saying, no, 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 there's no such thing as innocence there. But here we do. We have it. It's all being televised and all being transmitted, and it's startling.
Yeah, what I think is very interesting about this is first, these statements, these videos are all being listed, recorded, and submitted to the International Court of Justice. So this is the body of evidence. And as you say, the Israeli leaders have made their own body of evidence. They haven't hidden it. You just watch, and it's unbelievable. Second, it's clear that they live in a bubble. They're talking to their own followers. They're at rallies as if no one else is listening, but they're all being recorded and then translated. Third, they think, I'm sensing that by speaking in Hebrew, they're not speaking to the world, but the world hears all of this. It's not so hard to translate, to put subtitles to the videos. I think what you said is extremely right and important about the biblical quotations, because there's something complicated going on. Israeli society is multi-layered. There are many secular Jews who are afraid, and they are subject to fear and fear mongering. There are also highly religious Jews who live in a biblical or Talmudic world, meaning that their reference points are literally the Bible, not as an ancient text, but as their daily touchstone and reality. And for a very important part of religious Judaism in Israel, it's the Talmud, which is the interpretations of the Bible written down from oral law and then further interpretation, roughly from the first century AD up to the 4th or 5th century AD. So there's a lot of truly medieval thinking underway, and even biblical primitivism, I would say. And in the Bible, it's pretty shocking when you read the Bible, the Old Testament, especially parts of the book of Deuteronomy and a book called the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is after the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Torah. The next book is about the conquest of the land of Canaan, which then became basically the land that is claimed by Israelis today. And that was through a conquest. In the Jewish lore, the Jewish story, Jews escaped from Egypt, from the burdens of the Pharaoh, where they were slaves onto Egypt. They escaped, led by Moses. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, and then they conquered the lands that had other people in it. So this is actually the religious story, and it's based on the idea that God gave a promise to the Jewish people that this would be their land. And when they conquer the land in the book of Joshua, it's literally genocides, one after another. There are named populations, and the instructions to the Hebrews that have come to conquer the land is kill everybody in it. Pretty strange, actually. I have to say, I'm very secular. Reading this as religion is pretty grim. That it's a command of genocide. It's not we had a war to conquer what God promised us, but rather the instruction is don't be shy, Joshua. Don't hold back. Kill every man, woman, and child. And so it is a text, sad to say, of genocide and bloodshed. And then it's interpreted by rabbis in the Talmud afterwards. Okay, there's lots that can be said about ancient religious texts, but reading them literally as if it's the 2024 reality is not a very prudent thing to do, in my opinion. It is an invitation to mass killing. And the reason I go into all of this is that, sad to say, and it's shocking for me is because I'm an American Jew, to hear rabbis speak in this way. Rabbis, a rabbi for me is a religious figure, and in my upbringing, the idea was a rabbi was a holder of ethics, who helped to inform ethics in our Jewish community. But the ethics that the rabbis, not everyone by any means, so I don't want to be misunderstood, but there's a part of Israeli society that's very powerful politically right now, in which the rabbis talk about mass slaughter of Palestinians, as if it's basically the command of the book of Joshua. And to hear this is stunning. There are tapes that one can find of rabbis who lead yeshivas, these are religious schools, who are asked by their followers, and they're on video. These are then posted. Rabbi, do you mean to kill all the men and women? Yes, they are all guilty. They are all supporters. They are our enemies. They want to kill us. Rabbi, do you mean to kill the children? Yes, we should kill the children because they will grow up to be haters to kill us. And this is rabbis talking. So part of this that we're seeing of this lack of disguise of, intention is actually deep belief that is not seen inside this belief system as something wrong, but as actually something religious. I'm sorry to say it. It's grim, and over time there have been very knowledgeable religious Jewish critics in Israel over the last 50 years who wrote some important books that I had never read until the last year, and in fact, until recently in many cases, to try to understand what's going on, who warned about this, who said, look, this is what this strain of Judaism actually believes. It's not the Judaism I was at all inculcated with as an American, because grew up in America in what is necessarily a pluralistic society, and you don't base daily life on the Bible or on the Talmud, but some do. And then you get these unbelievable distortions that for me are completely shocking, but really are genocidal in clear intent and not hidden because they're not understood to be something to hide. They're understood to be something to follow God's will, even. So this is part of the story. It's rather complicated. It's not the whole story, but it's definitely a feature of what's happening right now.
Oh, I agree entirely, and I think it's something that most people are afraid to touch upon because obviously this is, I mean, any kind of discussion of anything critical of Israel is immediately going to get you labeled an anti-Semite. But if you,
But by the way, just to say safe, I can only surmise I'm very well read in general because I've spent my whole life with a book in my hand, basically. And I try to pack in every day as much understanding as I can. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand my own religious heritage and so forth. And I didn't know a lot of this until recently. And it was only looking at Smotrich and Ben Gvir and hearing these horrible, horrible, horrible things coming out of their mouth, and then going back and understanding that there were some very sophisticated warnings and analysis about this by professors at Hebrew University and elsewhere, who were then ostracized, by the way, in Israeli society, on exactly the grounds you said. But the reason I mention it is I really doubt that a lot of the American rich Jews who are very powerful in the Israel lobby in the United States have a clue about this. I don't think they know. I don't think they understand. Of course, they should be listening. They should be watching. And the basic point is, it cannot be right under any circumstances in the world to be killing civilians in mass numbers, no matter what, period. It's not even complicated. So I don't forgive them, but I do believe they don't understand actually even the cultural and in some cases the religious roots of this. And of course you're not allowed to say it, but the basic point is we need to speak as truthfully as possible for our own survival. That's the basic point.
absolutely, I agree entirely. I mean, I remember after September 11, there was open season on discussing how Islam contributes to terrorism, whether Islam is a religion of peace or Islam is a religion for terrorism. And I think that there's merit in having those arguments, whatever your opinion is.
Yeah, and by the way, usually claims that it's a religion of violence by people who don't have the slightest idea of what Islam actually is, but by American evangelical preachers who dominated the American scene.
Absolutely, and I think it's a lot clearer. In fact, in Islam, sure, some Muslims commit terrorism, but I think the injunction against harming women and children is pretty clear and uncontroversial. Even if some people might today misinterpret it or interpret it in a different way or say that the conditions are different, so we need to carry it out. But it's very difficult to make an argument for it. It's a lot more complicated when it comes to the Bible and the Talmud, because the Talmud also is more complicated to read because it's not as if it is out there giving you clear directive like Sharia law, which is saying you do this, you don't do that. It's
it's very, very complicated by the way. Very few people, except if you spent decades in a yeshiva, really know much about it.
And it's all about, considering the viewpoint and the counter viewpoint and then coming up with other counter viewpoints, and it's rabbis adding on to this over decades and centuries. So it's, it can get very controversial about what does this actually mean. So there's some pretty shocking verses about even raping children or things like that. But a more nuanced understanding is that, well, no, they're making the argument and they are making the argument for and argument against. I guess you could maybe make that case, but there is a big spectrum, and I think it's left unsaid that the part of that spectrum that is becoming dominant in Israeli policy over the past few years, but has always been extremely influential and was arguably very influential in 1948 as well, is the most hardline interpretation, which sees nothing but the idea that there's us, we're a tribe, and everybody who is going to get in our way deserves whatever is coming to them, and this is our land. God gave it to us. And so for me, the really horrific aspect of this is how it contradicts reality. Well, God gave you the land, and now there's children whose families have been living on that land for hundreds of years. Now, any civilized human being thinks, okay, this is property right. Those people own that property. I can't take it from them. But only it takes a special kind of religious fundamentalism to say, nope, that's completely invalid. It doesn't matter if you've owned that land. We can just completely get over that, and we're going to kick you out. And if you fight back, we're going to have to murder you and murder your entire family. And this is very mainstream.
Yeah, well, just to say, the history is complicated, and the complexities are, fascinating, but they don't in any way change my perception of the immediate situation, which is that this is a genocide that needs to stop today. But just to say, the first Zionist of modern Jewish history, Theodor Herzl in Vienna, knew nothing about Judaism. He's basically completely secular. He was not interested in the Holy Land per se. He was interested in a homeland for Jews because nationalism at the end of the 19th century was the absolute predominant ideology of the world, that you weren't anything if you didn't have a nation. And so Herzl, who knew nothing about Judaism, looked around and he had lots of ideas. Uganda, of course, was one famous place that he looked for. And history took its path, and Britain, definitely one of the most cynical countries in history, promised the land of what is today Israel and Palestine multiple times over to the Arabs, to the French, and to the Jews. So nothing like British perfidy. I think it's unrivaled. Whatever America knows, it learned from Britain, as far as I'm concerned. So in any event, that started, and most of the original Zionists were not religious. In fact, so many were deeply secular socialists, anti-religious, and society became complicated. But for me, my experience with Israel personally, of course, I have family in Israel, and therefore deeper relations. But my personal experience with Israel goes back to 1972, which was my first trip, so 52 years ago. And at the time, Israel was viewed broadly as a secular society. And of course, there was a religious component, but it was definitely a minority, and, even as today, looked down upon by the secularists and so forth. And the ideology of Israel was still pretty much a socialist kind of workers' party, secular ideology. The 6-Day War was of course, one can go back and talk about 1947 and 48, and there's a lot to talk about, but I just want to start with 1967, because the 6-Day War had, practically speaking, the effects that have led us to today in two different ways. When I first arrived in Israel in 1972, just about the first thing that was explained to me was that Israel was going to establish settlements in the Palestinian captured territories. And the phrase that was introduced to me for the first time, I was a high school student, was to make facts on the ground. So this was a completely, in my view at the time, secular view. It had a mix of security. It had a mix of why not? We won this territory. But the idea was we're going to settle these occupied lands. And that was a plan by a famous general at the time, Alon. It was called the Alon Plan. And Alon was not doing it on the grounds of Deuteronomy or the Book of Joshua or anything else. He was doing it on a mix of, I think, for him, overwhelmingly security. Okay, we're going to have security outposts throughout the West Bank, on the Jordan River, et cetera, et cetera. And it became more generally an idea, you win, you conquered, so we're going to make settlements. But then what happened, and I watched it, and I didn't understand it very well over time. Suddenly, there were demonstrations, or you'd see spontaneous dancing in the streets in the late 70s and early 80s of young people with, religious skull caps, kippah in Hebrew, kippot, dancing in this zealous way. And I asked, what is this? And it was a group called Gush Emonim. And this is a new religious movement. Now, what was that? This was the New Settlers movement, and it was led by rabbis, famous rabbis, who started preaching the religious line that this is our responsibility, almost a messianic responsibility, to settle these occupied lands because God gave us these lands. I believe, I'm not the deepest scholar in this, but I believe that there was a shift from the secularism, cynical, and so forth, but from the secularism to this religious movement that came with the settlements in the 1970s and 1980s. And there's some famous rabbis, Rabbi Kook the elder and Rabbi Kook the younger, his son, who promulgated a religious philosophy based on the Bible, that this is our land, God promised it, we're going to take it, and this is the redemption of the Jewish people through this. And of course, these settlements exploded in number to hundreds of thousands, and a lot of it was this religious movement. A lot of it was people who wanted swimming pools and cheap real estate, so it was, also totally opportunistic. But a lot of it was the religious movement. My own guess is that this was really something new. And by the way, there were divisions in the Orthodox community, because one of the most powerful of the traditional Orthodox communities here in Brooklyn, the Satmar community, is absolutely anti-Zionist, saying, it's idolatry to give so much attention to the land. We need to give attention to our morality, not to the land. And so you can find rabbis standing outside of the UN holding signs that say Zionism is against Judaism. And so there ensued within the religious communities a debate and a division in the 1980s onward. And there is a religious Zionism, which is messianic. It's based on Deuteronomy. It's based on the book of Joshua. It's based on the Talmud. It's based on the things we were talking about. There are other strands of religious Judaism that say exactly the opposite. But what I think happened in Israel is that this religious zealotry gained weight. And, in game theory, as you know well, the weight does not depend strictly on your share of the vote or your share of the population or your share of the seats in the parliament or the Knesset in Israel's case. It depends on whether you determine the governing coalition. And these religious parties that are in this nationalist religious line, and they're represented by this Bezalel Smotrich, for example, who is a leader of the settler movement and is a vulgarian and a genocidal figure as far as I'm concerned, and a senior official in the cabinet, is one of these coalition makers. Netanyahu, who is absolutely one of the darkest and most cynical politicians in modern times depends on this religious zealot for staying in power. We say in game theory that these small parties have high shapely values. It means that they have a high proportion of determining the coalition in power, even though they're not so dominant in the vote. And Ben Gvir is another one. These are horrible people, in my view. You know, they are murderous zealots. They believe what they say. That's why they're not hiding it. They speak to their followers. They have a huge weight in current Israeli politics because they'll bring down the government. And Netanyahu, who knows what his views are? He'll do anything and he'll kill women and children in mass numbers to stay in power. This is absolutely clear with Netanyahu. He's a perversion of politics in this way. But I think there was this change that is notable, maybe for Palestinians under the bombs. It's all very theoretical, what I've just said. But I think it's just important to understand how this evolved over time.
दोस्तों अगर आप वीडियो को स्पीड बढ़ाना चाहते हैं या घटाना चाहते हैं या वीडियो की आपने बहुत सारी वीडियो में देखा होगा कि जिसमें लोग वीडियो की स्पीड बढ़ा देते हैं या बिल्कुल ही वीडियो को स्लो कर देते हैं। तो आज इस वीडियो में मैं आपको यही सिखाऊंगा, आपने वीडियो पर बने रहना है ताकि आपको मैं बहुत ही अच्छी तरीके से सिखा पाऊँ। और एक बार अगर आप ये वीडियो देख लोगे तो आप बहुत ही अच्छी तरीके से वीडियो को वीडियो में वो सब कुछ कर सकते जो मैं आपको बताऊंगा। और इसी वजह अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छी लगे तो आपने वीडियो को लाइक कर देना है और चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर देना है, जिससे कि आपको वीडियो पूरी अगर दोस्तों आप ये वीडियो पूरी देख लेते तो आप किसी भी वीडियो की स्पीड बढ़ा या घटा सकोगे। तो आपने वीडियो पर बने रहना है ताकि मैं आपको अच्छे तरीके से वीडियो में जो वीडियो को अगर आप स्पीड बढ़ाना चाहते हैं घटाना चाहते हैं, आप अच्छी तरह से कई मास्टर को सीख सको। दोस्तों इस वीडियो में मैं आपको सिखाऊंगा कि आप वीडियो की स्पीड कम या ज़्यादा कैसे कर सकते हैं। दोस्तों बहुत सारे लोग ऐसे होते हैं। दोस्तों आज की इस वीडियो में मैं आपको वीडियो में काटा लगाना सिखाऊंगा, जैसे कि जिस तरह के से लोग वीडियो में काटा लगाते हैं। और अगर कोई पार्ट अगर कोई सही तरह से वीडियो में ना अगर किसी वीडियो में आपको वीडियो में काट लगाना पड़े या फिर आपको वीडियो कुछ पार्ट जो आप वीडियो का बनाए वो आपको अच्छा ना लगे तो आप उसकी जगह नया ऐड कर सकते हो। वो बहुत ही आपको आसान है। इसके लिए आपको पूरी वीडियो देखनी पड़ेगी और आपको अच्छे तरीके से आपको वीडियो को समझना पड़ेगा और पूरा देखना, जिससे आप वीडियो को जो भी पार्ट आपको वीडियो का अच्छा ना लगे वो आप आसानी के साथ काट कर सकते हो और अच्छे तरीके से उसकी जगह नया पार्ट लगा सकते हो या फिर वो बिल्कुल ही रिमूव हो जाएगा। तो आपको मैं काइंड मास्टर बहुत ही आसान तरीके से समझाऊंगा था आपको बहुत ही अच्छी तरीके से समझ आ जाएगी इस वीडियो की। आपने वीडियो में बने रहना है ताकि आपको वीडियो की पूरी समझ आ सके।